So I am honored to have Chris Giancarlo, the chairman of the CFTC. He's addressed this organization, this AGM, the previous AGM, and we're really happy to have you back again. A little more informal fireside chat, but you come bearing gifts, as it were. You have a new paper out. You should all know it's in your app, in the documents at the very bottom. Swaps Reform 2.0 is at the bottom of the doc, so you can pull that up. It's only 148 pages, a real quick read, but don't read it now. We have the chairman who is going to tell you what is in his new initiative or collection of initiatives. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for joining us, and please tell us, what is Swaps 2.0?
Well, my pleasure, and it's great to follow Craig, because in many ways our paper follows the 4 Treasury reports that Craig and his team put out last year. And I can tell you, with all the work we put into putting one paper, they did 4 papers last year. So it really, we knew those were substantial works, but I can tell you from the inside what went into it. Now, what a big task that was. And one other thing, you mentioned what this administration has brought. Sometimes in the press, it's often described as business-friendly or industry-friendly. You know, what it is economy-focused. And our role at the CFTC, I always push back when people say, well, you've brought an industry-friendly. No, we've brought a market-focused approach. We take no sides, have no favoritism for any side of the market participants. Our focus is what's in the best interest of the markets. Our mission is market integrity, market health, and integrity also means market vibrancy. A healthy market is a vibrant market. A healthy market is a market that's free of fraud and manipulation. But a healthy market is not one that's necessarily friendly to any group. It's a market focus. And so our mission of being market focused, I think, fits within the entire administration's focus of being economy focused. How do we take an economy that was growing at an unsatisfactory 1.5% and turn it into an economy that grows at a more traditional American 3+%. And that's been our focus. And do it in a way that, yes, retains the systemic stability safeguards that were put in place in the wake of the financial crisis. So introducing our white paper, I start from the point, Scott, that you know well, that I'm a longstanding supporter of the provisions that became Title VII of Dodd-Frank. And I support them based upon my market experience, having been in the marketplace before the crisis, and having been one of a team that tried to create and actually successfully created the world's first CDS clearinghouse, which is today ICE Clear Credit. Back then it was called the Clearing Corp. And we brought the idea of bringing CDS. So we believed in central clearing of swaps. I believed in trade reporting of swaps, and to this day believe that had regulators more visibility into the counterparty credit exposure of major financial institutions, the regulatory response to the crisis could have been much more tailored, specific, speedy, and improved. I believe in the mandate that swaps execution should take place on licensed platforms. It was always an anomaly to me that if you wanted to trade a credit default, if you wanted to trade an equity, you'd go to a licensed broker dealer. If you wanted to trade a agricultural future, you'd go to a licensed introducing broker. And yet if you wanted to trade a credit default swap, you would go to an unlicensed platform. So those core reforms are ones I believed in from my industry experience, not as a political matter, as a commercial matter. And I brought that to the table in my private life. I commended Congress and the president when Dodd-Frank was passed with regard to Title VII in 2010, and have been consistent in that in my work as a minority commissioner and today as chairman. Our white paper, which I'll get to in just a second, falls in a stream of assessments of regulation that are being done. The Treasury reports, in many ways, were assessments of what's been done, what's working, what's not working. But on the international side, the Europeans themselves did a review of their reforms last year, and the FSB, along with BCBS, IOSCO, CPMI, are engaged in an assessment right now of capital requirements and their impact on the clearing mandate. So our work in our white paper of assessing the CFTC's implementation of swaps reform, I think falls within a time when we are, with 10 years now, looking at the reform. So what have we done? Well, we sought to do a review of all of the core implementation by the CFTC. That is, swaps clearing, swaps reporting, swaps execution, dealer capital, and end user issues, including margin on uncleared swaps. And as an agency that implemented most of its reforms by 2014, we now have a body of data and a body of experience of our directors and deputy directors in the agency of what's worked well, what's worked less well, what could be improved on. But we also have the benefit of many participants in the marketplace in their comment letters that have been submitted to the Commission over this period of time. And further, we have a very rich body of academic work of economists and others that have looked at the reforms. So there's really a very, very rich body of experience, of data to draw upon in assessing 4 years' experience with our swaps reforms. So we sat down to do that. We met with all of our divisions and our staffs, took from them their best ideas, their best insights, and our new chief economist, Bruce Tuckman, and I have produced a white paper looking at those 5 areas of implementation. We call it Swaps Regulation version 2.0, and what we did was we analogized regulation to software. In many ways, regulation is like software. What is software? It's a series of instructions that say in certain actions, there should be certain reactions, and it pre-codes it. In a lot of ways, regulation is like that. And I had the good fortune in my career to spend a little bit of time in a software company. And one thing you realize in software is when the core framework is set down, the key element after that becomes maintenance. You've invested so much in this. If you don't maintain it, if you don't upgrade it, if you don't look at it, you've got sunk costs, you've wasted that value. In a lot of ways, Title VII is like the core framework, and the job of maintaining it falls to regulators. It's not one and done. It's what have we learned? How do we improve? How do we broaden the base? How do we develop enhancements? How do we develop functions that didn't work so well? How do we take out the hard plugs that are in that model and replace them with true variables? And so that's sort of our model for this. And from there on, we've made a number of suggestions in a whole bunch of areas. But that's the element of this that we've tried to do. And I encourage everybody here to take the time to read it. There's no simple takeaway. It's complex, it's nuanced. But I'll give you the quick scoop. On swaps clearing, it's worked very well. That initial mandate has been extraordinarily successful, as a lot of data sets, including your own at ISDA, has reported. In fact, version 1.1 has been so successful, the question then becomes, what are the second and third order magnitude of that? So if I can give you an example, when the iPhone came out and had a camera in it, what an extraordinary thing that was. It's changed the dynamics of photography. And yet the truth of the matter is, it wasn't a very good camera. Apple has made the camera has gotten much better over time, but just the simple fact of the camera is pretty extraordinary. Well, in a lot of ways, clearing was pretty extraordinary to be mandated. Again, it was a movement that was already taking place in the industry. But now, what are the second and third order impacts of the success of that mandate? We in some ways have supersized our clearinghouses. So how do we now deal with issues of the resiliency of their collateral, the recovery processes, and then, of course, what do we do in terms of resolution? One of the things we've tried to do in our white paper is demystify a lot of the elements of central clearing of swaps. And for an audience like that, it's probably less necessary. But a white paper like this will be read by policymakers that have other things on their agenda and don't spend a lot of time thinking about swaps clearing. So we wanted to demystify a lot of that. Maybe I'll take a pause here and come back to some of the other elements in a minute.
Well, in here, swaps, as you pointed out, the five steps. After central clearing, you have the swap reporting rules. I think by all measures, those have been suboptimal in terms of what it's taken to produce the data and then the fact that you can't share it.
So here's a fascinating thing. There will invariably be reports on my approach to swaps execution where I'm searching for more flexibility. But conversely, in the area of data reporting, I'm saying we need more specificity. The data reporting, I think, was probably one of the most broadly accepted elements of the reforms, and yet the CFTC's first crack at this almost had an assumption that all the data would look like futures data. It would be homogenized, it would be clear, it would be standard nomenclature, standard terminology. Well, it didn't work out that way. As we know, swaps data had no standard nomenclature. In fact, not only did it have no standard nomenclature across the industry, even within some of the same firms, there wasn't standard nomenclature. So that all needs to be developed. And the CFTC is very committed and very active and leads in many of those ways. There's still work to be done in this mandate, but with our roadmap that we introduced in July of 2017, we believe we've set a path to getting there by the end of 2019. We're very actively engaged at the international level, developing UPI, UTI standards, and we're confident we'll get there. On the area of swaps execution, that's an area where I've long felt that Congress got it right, the CFTC got it wrong. Congress said flexible modes of execution, any means of interstate commerce. The CFTC said, just like Henry Ford, you can have any means of interstate commerce you want as long as it's RFQ or order book. Well, the fact of the matter is swaps have a very different liquidity profile than do futures. If I can simplify, the futures market looks like the stock market. Continuous liquidity from the time the market opens to the time it ends. Swaps look more like the bond market. It's an episodically liquid market. Episodically liquid markets do not trade on central limit electronic order books. You can require that CEFs have them, you can do everything you want, but it just doesn't work that way. And so what we've said is do what Congress said, have a flexible mode of execution. Now, what are the ramifications of the way we've done this, the incorrect way? Well, global fragmentation, as ISDA is so well documented. We have seen global markets for swaps fragment into regional markets, fragment into US and non-US markets. And if the goal is systemic stability, what is the impact of fragmentation? It's global fragility. It's like marketplaces are like ecosystems. If you take a broad ecosystem and break it up into a whole series of sub-ecosystems, you introduce fragility into the system. And that's what we've done with our swaps rules. So I know Amir Zaidi was here yesterday and said that we are actively working on a rule proposal, which we expect to have this summer. And I'm very excited about it. It's something that I've been focused on for a long time. I think going to a more flexible mode of execution will strengthen our swaps execution mandate. It will be fully within the spirit and the letter of Congress in Title VII. And I think that it's going to lead to a more robust and healthy marketplace for swaps.
Good. Now, we had your co-author, your economist, Bruce Tuckman, was on a panel hosted by our own Steve Kennedy, and they talked about the margin period of risk, some thresholds for end user, and the ramifications of non-cleared margin. And is it set at the right level? Is it risk appropriate, et cetera? You touch on that in Section 5, the end user exception. You want to give us a...
Yeah, let me talk about that for a second. You know, to go back to my analogy of rule frameworks as software, when you come out with the first version of software, often it will contain hard plugs, non-variable elements, simply because you need to prove the whole thing works. But they could be improved with replacing them with variables. The perfect example of a hard plug in the first implementation of swaps reform on the US side, but also globally, is the standardized calculation of 10-day margin on uncleared swaps. Now, as someone who managed swaps trading platforms, there are many swaps that you can liquidate in a 10-day period of time. There's some you can liquidate in a 10-minute, some you can liquidate in 10 days. But there's some that may take 10 months. The use of a 10-day liquidation horizon is simply a hard plug. It needs to be replaced with a variable that would truly reflect the liquidation horizon and therefore the marginability, the margin calculation for swaps. So fine, version 1, you need to have hard plugs, but it's now time to move beyond that. We've now developing the data sets. We're now developing the intelligence. There's no reason why moving forward we cannot move and come up with a better margin calculation than that.
Now, I think one of the big questions, and you touched on it briefly in terms of, and Amir did as well, timetable. Mm-hmm. This is an aggressive agenda. You've put some of these things out for comment already, the data in particular. You've got the extensive white paper on CEF, so we understand what's going there. When does this play out? How long does it take to play out? And the crucial question, as we all served as in different roles as commissioners, will you be there to see it through?
Well, let me start with the big picture. I'm committed to a process of, in rule writing, ready, aim, fire. I think at a period of time, it was a little bit more ready, fire, then aim. Aim by using no action relief, and aim by passing rules and then delaying the implementation of them. No, let's ready, aim, fire. What we try to do in here is aim. And I'm looking forward to feedback. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. What we'd like to do is get the rules right in the first instance. I'm also committed to getting back to regular order at the commission. People here that have lived through what we all lived through back in 2012 and 13, 4 or 5 rule proposals going at the same time in terms of comment periods, having to respond to that. I don't think anybody wants to go back to that. I don't think that's good government. Now, I'm not faulting my predecessors. They had timetables that were set by Congress. There was things that had to be done. I get that in the wake of a crisis, but we're not in the wake of a crisis now. We're in a period of a good economic order. We're in a period of peacetime, and it's in all of our interest to get rules right. So that's not to say we don't have an ambitious and active agenda. Amir mentioned he's working on this. We're also working on position limits. We're working on de minimis. We've got a number of things going on. We will stay very, very active. We've got a great team of division directors at the agency, some people with some great marketplace experience, great energy and enthusiasm. The agency, I think, is in a very good place morale-wise now. Though it has to be said, we have suffered a funding issue going back several years now, and that is challenging in terms of a very ambitious agenda. Nevertheless, we will move forward. We are going to move forward in regular order, but in good order. We will get a lot done. In terms of oversight and my role as chairman, Washington was set up the way Washington was set up long before I came into town. My term was preordained when I was sworn in 2014. After next April 2019, I serve at the pleasure of the president. I would want to presume the president's pleasure in my service after April next year, but I'm sure the time will come for a conversation. And I'm not somebody to drop the mic and walk off the floor. There's work to be done, and I'm a good patriot, and I'd like to see this work done, and I will work with the administration, and we'll determine how that's done. But we will put a good process in place between now and then with very active management, and then we'll see how the White House and what they want to do.
Fantastic. He's all in. Now, I must also compliment you. There was an aggressive rule writing process that I was around for, and some of these ready, fire, aim comments may have come up, and I was constantly told, but don't worry, Scott, we'll go back and fix it. So, thank you. It may be a little later than they anticipated, but the fact is it was always a promise, it was always a commitment that if we didn't get it right, we'd come back to fix it. And so,
as folks read through this, you'll see that's what we do here. And I think we're very balanced in our approach. There's some issues where we say there's an issue here. We prefer the marketplace work it out. Mm-hmm. In a number of cases here, we say, as regulators, we could intervene. We'd rather see marketplace-driven solutions. In other cases, we do say, there's a bigger role for the regulators here. But we ask a lot of questions as well as we try to address a lot of answers. Look, the first implementation of this was a huge lift. I mean, with credit to what you and others and Chairman Gensler did, you did a lot, Scott. I mean, I don't know whether the percentage is somewhere between 60 and 80, but 60 and 80% of it's done and working. Yeah. It's pretty remarkable. And compliments to market participants too, because they had to deal with the comment letters, they had to weigh in, and they had to do it in a very short order. So it's quite remarkable what's being done. We have the luxury of time now to get that last, 20 to 40%. And I don't want to say last, because I don't think you're ever last, because the market's always evolving. As comprehensive as Dodd-Frank was, it didn't address cyber. It didn't address the digitization of markets, algorithmic trading, some of the very issues that we're facing. So as important all this is, it's still also very backward looking, and we have to be looking forward at the same time. The presence of new technology in the market is tremendously challenging, and Craig Phillips mentioned Bitcoin, but we spent a lot of time in the fall that might have been spent on swaps reform, actually looking at cryptocurrency and what does that mean for markets and how does that change things. So
I do want to come back to technology to answer this hashtag CryptoDad thing you got going. But I do want to talk, we had a great panel yesterday on cross-border. Your chief of staff, Mike Gill, was up there, but the Brexit third-party recognition, we talked about CCPs. That's an issue that you've addressed in the past. Obviously, the reg reform is going to adjust that relationship. It is a bit frustrating. There are a lot of rules that are very close, right? The G20 set out consistent global framework, whether it's Japan, Europe, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong. The rules are in place. They're very similar in terms of outcomes. We at ISDA believe that you should focus on the risk-based rules and then recognize the rest of them. And we're very pleased that you achieved such success around to get recognition prior to MiFID II implementation on that trade execution platform. But as you kind of look through, it's not in isolation, right? You've got pre- and post-trade reporting requirements, which are completely different and a bit of a mess. So to fully take advantage of these things, to restore that global pool of liquidity, we need to have good cross-border harmonization. And I'm pleased Craig touched on this. Obviously Bill Cohen, who spoke yesterday, talked about a global capital framework. How do you see the cross-border relationship playing out today? Where do we make progress?
Yeah, so much
in Brexit.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said there. But I must say I'm amused by the fact that Brexit, which is a European-wide debate and fracturing. I'm amused by the fact that something that's fractious like that in Europe would actually cause a complete coalescing of American interests. So there is no divide between Congress, the White House, the regulatory agencies, Republicans and Democrats on this issue. It is the American position that U.S. CCPs need to be regulated and overseen by U.S. regulators. Full stop. I've never seen such unity on an issue brought about because of disunity on what's going on the other side. So it's a fascinating concept. I've had continue to have very good conversations with my European counterparts to make clear the clarity of the U.S. position on this. And I'm hoping that we can resolve it sooner rather than later. The alternative is we don't resolve it now, Brexit happens, and we find ourselves sitting down with our European colleagues several years from now discussing U.S. CCPs, at which point I'll simply repeat, what about what I said in 17 was not clear. Now, there is an important systemic impact of swaps clearing for our colleagues in Europe. And that should be the conversation we should be having. What is the role in, as you know, the only role the US has at LCH has to do with the US swaps book. And so that's a conversation that I think is time for us to have and focus on that conversation. Not, though, a much more broad notion that there should be somehow co-supervision of our US domestic CCPs. More broadly, however, though, as I think you noted, I'm a big believer in cross-border harmonization. Under my watch, we got 2 very important equivalence determinations done in very short order in 2017. And part of that is because of a very good relationship and a very respectful and direct relationship I think I've been able to achieve with Valdis Dombrovskis, Vice President of the EU. We've worked very well together. I have a great deal of both professional and personal respect for Valdis as a person of integrity and very clear and straight. And I think so we've achieved a lot there, and I expect to achieve more. And I expect actually to resolve this issue on CCP supervision so we can get on to so many more issues that we need to clarify. Swaps reporting, others. Ultimately, though, Scott, I think in the wake of the financial crisis, in the rush for harmonization, we kind of lost a little bit of perspective. We thought that every rule that came out of swaps reform needed to be mirrored identically across border. That's not right. Some of those rules do. I mean, some of those rules are really important, whether it's dealer capital and margin. Some of those are important for systemic risk. But many of the rules are pure mechanics. If we require RFQ to 3 and another jurisdiction has RFQ to 13, what different? It has nothing to do with systemic risk. If we have a reporting requirement of 10 seconds and someone else has 20 seconds, I mean, it makes no difference. And so what we need to do is actually look at rules and say which ones truly have to do with the transmission of risk around the globe and identify those for closer harmonization. And the ones that have to do with pure mechanics, we should have a wide notion of deference for those jurisdictions like the EU that have adopted their response to the G20, have adopted their swaps reform. And so I did an op-ed in Les Echos, the French financial newspaper, last fall, in which I said, we believe in deference. Let's get to a deferential approach when it comes to the mechanics of swaps execution. A trade's done in Frankfurt, do it the European way. Even if it involves US parties, if it's about the mechanics. Transaction done in New York, Chicago, do it the American way when it comes to the mechanics. And the perfect example is the IPO market. If you want an IPO, a company that has 2 golden shares, non-voting shares, you can do it in New York. You can't do it in Hong Kong. In London, you have, at least, I'm dating myself here a little bit, but when I was practicing law in this area, you had to have 3 years of positive cash flow. I don't know if that's still true today, but you didn't in New York. And guess what? All those different marketplaces worked, and nobody saw that as a reason for systemic risk. Why? Because they all had the core elements of full disclosure, of a liability for misrepresentation, of anti-fraud manipulation. The core elements that we all recognize that are important for an IPO marketplace. The world exists with different IPO markets, with different mechanics, but the same core principles. And that should be our approach to swaps execution. If a jurisdiction has adopted the reforms and on an outcomes basis they're broadly equivalent, then fine, the mechanics in your jurisdiction apply. And just because an American person is there, they shouldn't have to abide by American mechanics. And so I think we can get there. And we didn't address cross-border in this. We will be addressing cross-border this year in a broad sense. Yep. And that will then lead to changes as well.
Good. We are running out of time. We've run out of time, actually. But I do want to touch on the issue of technology broadly. We have a couple of panels. Actually, we'll have a break, but then we'll have a technology panel. And you've talked, you spent a lot of time actually talking about cryptocurrencies, the new futures products that you've permitted. But rather than get into that, let's, AI, machine learning, cryptocurrency, distributed ledger, you know as well that ISDA is working on to set those data standards to create the common domain model that we think can really lend to automation and innovation in our space by setting standards. But how do you see the technology playing out in this market? What do you like? What do you not like, frankly?
Well, I think it's daunting because it's so profound. So, when I tell my 84-year-old mother what I do, I often reference the movie Trading Places and those pits because it's something you can understand. Fact of the matter is, that might as well have been the 12th century. I mean, that marketplace is so far gone. Our markets have gone through the same digital revolution that's affected everything else in our lives. And it's a brave new world in markets, and all of those technologies are. I saw a presentation recently about the development of bots that can be sent into the marketplace to find liquidity bubbles, to find liquidity squeezes, to find positions in the market, and they're entirely automated. As I was watching this, it reminded me of a movie that will date me called The Incredible Voyage, where they actually go in the human body in a little capsule. It's like a bot that goes through the marketplace and finds liquidity. I mean, the markets are transforming so tremendously, and to some degree, I want to get these swaps things done because it's kind of 20th century, because we need to turn and now look out the front windshield to focus on the 21st century. And how does regulation adjust? And I'll leave you with one further thought. What's so challenging about distributed ledger technology is its disruptive nature. But if you think about it from a regulator's point of view, it's profoundly disrupting, because the whole way regulators regulate markets is they identify those trusted intermediaries that validate everything, and they register them and require them to kind of either be SROs or close to the regulator. Well, how do we do that job when they've all been disintermediated into the marketplace? So distributed ledger technology is going to be totally disruptive for the industry, but totally disruptive for regulators around the globe as well. So it's a new era. It's very challenging. And as much as we want to get the response to the last crisis done right, we really need to up our game, and Brian Quintens, who's heading up our TAC committee, is doing some interesting work building on the work that you started in looking at this. We've got so much more we need to do. I'm very proud of our Lab CFTC initiative. It's almost like the big limestone building of the regulator, we took a sledgehammer to one wall and opened up a door and said, innovators, come on through here so you can talk to us. Help us get up to speed on this. At the same time, we help you navigate through our rules and regulations that were not written for a digital world, but were written for an analog world. So we've got to update that rule book as well.
Well, I know we are changing the marketplace. There are significant changes in who's monitors and oversees these things, and some of the SROs. But it's a good thing you have important trade associations that can think about these things, lead the thought, and develop new solutions going forward, like ISDA. So you can count on us to help out in that regard. But obviously, one role you have in that's to make sure that markets work appropriately. And you've talked about transforming the CFTC into a 21st century regulator. And I couldn't agree more, right? You cannot look at the millions of trades a day, let alone go back into the order book and understand how those things play out. You have a new mandate with the swaps market in electronic trading and oversight, and how those work together and where risk resides. What's it going to take to be a 21st century regulator? I mean, let's just set the budget aside. What's the vision for what that is? And then we'll get the checkbook out later.
Yeah, so the budget is the 800-pound elephant in the room. So you almost can't put the budget aside. So just to give you an example, we get an enormous amount of data, and therefore we have an enormous amount of enormous data analysis tasks to done. Well, how is big data analysis done today in a 21st century world? How does Google do it? How does Amazon do it? It's automated. There is very good technology out there that looks for pattern recognition that can do it. We don't have any of that.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say we don't have any of that. We don't have enough of that. Okay, so we're still we have 21st century data. We're kind of a late 20th century data analytical engine. We need to be a 21st century data analytical engine, and that's about resource. We know what technology we need. We know who's the vendor. We know how to get it. if we had the resources, we'd have it tomorrow. So that's a big part of it. Resources are a big part of it. And then the other part of it is mindset. And I think that we began the conversation talking about, what this new administration's brought. What we've brought is a mindset that's a market-focused mindset, not a politically focused mindset. Not to take away from politics. I know it's Washington after all, but we've brought a market-focused mindset, and that's what I try to bring to it. If the commercial side of our industry is using sophisticated tools to analyze data, why are we not as a regulator? And that should be our approach. And so much throughout everything we do. Just a small anecdote. Lab CFTC was out in Silicon Valley talking to companies out there. One company came in with a really cool pattern recognition technology, and it was so cool, we had to license it. We found the resources. We're now running this technology. And it's really, we're doing some really interesting things with it inside the agency. We would have never known about it without our Lab CFTC initiative. So it's a mindset, and boy, if we had the resources, what we could do would be, I think, would break great. And would be good for the industry. I think there was a period of time where people thought, let's keep that regulator poor and out of the way. That might be good for the markets. I think we're all way beyond that in terms of professional maturity. I think a smart, well-run, intelligent regulator is in the best interest of the marketplace. And I say that as a former marketplace operator. I believe a smart regulator is the best thing that could happen to the swaps marketplace, along with trade association partners that identify issues, refine the issue through their surveys, through their data analysis, and then help us address it in an intelligent way.
Well, obviously we could go on and on, but to keep the rest of the schedule on board, please join me in thanking Chairman Chris Giancarlo for his time.